Some men die for faith, some for betrayal, but Hugh Despenser, he died for the sin of wanting everything. He was not born a king, not born a saint. He was born a shadow, a greedy, crawling thing that learned to smile like a man. He seduced not just a monarch, but a kingdom, sank his teeth into the throne, and for years England bled while he drank. He crushed nobles, stole from widows, tortured his enemies, and whispered into the ears of a king whose love blinded him to blood. They called him the king's favorite, but by the end, he was the kingdom's curse. His enemies weren't rebels, they were survivors, and when they came for him, they didn't just kill him. They unmade him, tied like livestock, castrated while still breathing, gutted like a pig before a crowd, then burned, a final purge of filth, smoke, and screams. This is not a story of romance or politics. This is a descent into obsession, tyranny, and pain. And if you've seen how Edward II and Queen Isabella destroyed each other, then you already know this kingdom was a coffin, and Hugh Despenser was the fire inside it. They say evil men rise with ambition, but Hugh Despenser, he rose from nothing, no vision, no fire, no destiny, just the quiet, cold instinct of a man who knew how to crawl. He was born a second son, too small to inherit, too plain to notice. The kind of noble who dined at the edge of the table and smiled when insulted, because he couldn't afford not to. His father, Hugh the Elder, was loyal to the crown, but loyalty doesn't pass through blood like a sword. What flowed in the younger's veins was something else entirely, something slower and far more patient. At court, no one feared him. Why would they? He was forgettable, mild, the sort of shadow that followed power but never cast any. And yet, there's something dangerous about a man who learns to observe before he strikes. Hugh didn't speak often, but when he did, it was never to speak truth. It was to test the waters, who was weak, who was vain, who could be used. And there, at the fringes of the royal court, he found someone as misplaced as he was, someone lonelier, someone weaker than a throne should ever allow. His name was Edward, the king, and Hugh saw what others refused to see, not a sovereign, but a man desperately craving to be loved. That was all he needed. Power doesn't always walk through the front gate. Sometimes it slips into a man's heart while he's still grieving. Edward II was a lonely king, isolated, ridiculed, burdened with a crown that never quite fit his head. He had lost his closest companion, Piers Gaveston, in a storm of politics and steel. The court cheered the death. Edward mourned it like a widow. That's when Hugh arrived, not as a rival, not as a soldier, but as a replacement. He didn't need to fight for the king's attention. He simply filled the void like mold in an open wound. He played the game beautifully. He wasn't charming, he was obedient, not passionate, just present. A silent confidant who never judged, never pushed, never looked away when the king wept behind stone doors. And in return, Edward gave him everything. Land, titles, power, his bed. It didn't matter what the barons whispered. It didn't matter what the priests condemned. The king was starved for affection, and Hugh fed him drop by drop, touch by touch, until the monarch became dependent, addicted, blind. Hugh wrapped himself around the king like ivy around a dying tree, slowly choking the trunk, feeding from its strength, smiling as it withered. By the time the nobles noticed what was happening, it was too late. Hugh wasn't just close to the king, he was the king's will, his decisions, his justice, his punishment. Those who protested found their lands stripped, their sons imprisoned, their names erased. He didn't swing the sword, but his whisper guided the hand that did. And through it all, Edward looked on with soft eyes, too in love or too weak to see what Hugh had become. The court began to rot. The nobles saw it. The people felt it. But Hugh, he reveled in it, because love was never the goal. Control was. And control is best tested in how much you can steal before anyone dares say no. Once the king was his, the kingdom followed. Hugh Despenser no longer asked, he took. And when he took, he didn't use swords or banners. He used paper, seals, royal decrees signed by a trembling hand that still believed it was in love. He began quietly reclaiming disputed estates, revoking misused titles, but it grew fast, violent. He accused lords of treason without trial, seized castles in the name of loyalty, confiscated lands from barons whose only crime was speaking too freely. Widows were stripped of inheritance, children dispossessed before they learned to read. Every stolen acre was funneled back into his coffers, and still it wasn't enough. He auctioned justice, sold pardons to murderers while hanging dissenters by the dozen. Nobles who once dined with the king now watched their homes burn, their names erased, their bloodline broken beneath boots and banners. The law bent where he willed it. Fear became policy. Loyalty was just another currency, but it wasn't just power, it was pleasure. Hugh began kidnapping the wives of his enemies, holding them for ransom, violating them under the silent blessing of royal silence. He didn't need to be discreet. He was untouchable. One noblewoman was locked away until she surrendered her lands. Another was found wandering the roads barefoot, face bruised, name unspoken, mind shattered. The message was clear. Speak against Despenser, and you won't just lose your land, you'll lose your lineage. What made him monstrous wasn't that he ruled beside the king. It was that he made cruelty feel like law, and greed feel like order. To the common folk, he became a phantom, a name whispered at night by families who'd lost everything. To the nobles, he was worse than a tyrant. He was a disease the king refused to cure, and in the royal chambers, Edward still smiled, still listened, still loved, but not everyone bowed. Far from the court, another fire was rising, one that would not be silenced with gold or fear, and its name was Isabella. While the lords knelt and the people trembled, one woman watched and did not flinch. Queen Isabella, daughter of France, wife of a hollow king. She had seen her marriage rot from the inside day by day as Edward clung not to her, but to the serpent wrapped around his throne. She played the role at first, graceful, silent, but silence in a queen is not surrender, it's calculation. She endured the insults, the exile from council, the theft of her lands by Hugh's greedy hands. But behind those ice-blue eyes, something colder was forming. She left England not as a wife, but as a weapon. And when she returned, she would not come alone. She had crossed the sea with her son, the future king, and with a lover no less ruthless than Hugh. Roger Mortimer. Their plan was not to reason. It was to cleanse, burn the throne if they had to, tear out the rot by its roots. And somewhere in his stolen palace, Hugh laughed. He thought the queen still played chess. But Isabella was done playing. The tyrant just didn't know the knives had already been drawn. And in the heart of England, while banners rose against him, Hugh Despenser prepared to become more than feared. He would become untouchable. When a parasite feeds long enough, it begins to believe it owns the host. And when Hugh Despenser looked at England, he didn't see a kingdom. He saw property. He no longer whispered to the king, he spoke through him. Decrees bore the royal seal, but the words were Hugh's, written in hunger, signed in malice. Barons were exiled, judges replaced, enemies condemned before they even opened their mouths. The court had turned into a butcher's ledger, and Hugh's name was scrawled in every margin. He built a private spy network, loyal only to him. Paid informants tracked dissent like bloodhounds. Even priests were watched, sermons twisted into treason at the flick of his fingers. One lord was executed for a dream he never had, another for a letter he never wrote. And always the crown defended it, because Hugh made sure the crown was blind. He taxed the desperate, starved the countryside, declared debts where none existed, then seized land when they couldn't be paid. The law became a rope, and he pulled it tighter with every smile. At court, nobles kissed his hand and cursed him in their prayers, but no one dared act, not while he still stood beside the king like a shadow with teeth. Some said Hugh had bewitched Edward. Others whispered darker things, that the king no longer ruled because he no longer remembered how. He was a hollow figure wrapped in silks and silence, and beside him stood Despenser, dressed in velvet, speaking of loyalty, but ruling like a knife rules flesh. This wasn't ambition anymore, it was gluttony, ritual, hunger without end. And then, as if summoned by wrath itself, the sea began to rise. Because across the channel, Isabella was coming home, and she wasn't bringing mercy. They thought she was gone, that she'd vanished into foreign courts, lost behind veils of diplomacy and silence. But Isabella did not retreat. She gathered, she waited, and when she returned, it wasn't as a wife, it was as a reaper. In 1326, the channel broke with steel. Isabella landed with a small army, her son beside her, her lover Roger Mortimer flanking her like a blade unsheathed. But it wasn't the soldiers that toppled England, it was the people, the nobles, the barons who had bled under Hugh's heel and finally saw a banner worth dying for. City gates opened without resistance. Towns rose up like wounds reopening, and everywhere Hugh had planted fear, fire bloomed in its place. His network collapsed. His spies turned silent. Allies disappeared overnight. Some betrayed him with coins, others with smiles. Even Edward, panicked, humiliated, seemed to shrink before the woman he once cast aside. They fled, king and favorite, running not like rulers, but like hunted men, because the storm hadn't just come for the throne. It had come for Hugh Despenser's soul, and in the dark corners of the realm, they were already building the scaffold. You'd think a tyrant would fall with thunder, with fire, steel, and screams, but Hugh Despenser's fall began with silence. No army, no defense, just locked doors and turned backs. The kingdom he fed on had finally vomited him out. He fled with the king, dragging behind him stolen gold, broken titles, and a crown that no longer mattered. Towns refused them, allies vanished, they slept in barns, ate scraps, changed clothes with peasants to blend in, though no disguise could hide Hugh's stench. It wasn't dirt that clung to him, it was history. When they were finally caught, it wasn't in battle, it was in shame. Edward surrendered like a man who had already died inside. Hugh tried to run, alone, stripped of king, armor, and luck. He was found near Lantricent, gaunt, filthy, dressed in rags, a few coins in his boot, rotting meat in his satchel. His body shook not from fear, but from withdrawal. Power had been his drug, and now the hunger showed in his eyes. He was paraded through the streets like refuse, jeered, spat on, dragged through mud and blood. The man who once held the entire kingdom beneath his thumb now whimpered like a dog at the feet of men he used to spit on. They did not strike him, not yet, because death would have been mercy. Instead, they dressed him in royal robes, mocking the luxury he once drowned in, and tied him backwards on a mangy horse, his face exposed to every stone and insult. But this wasn't a public humiliation. It was preparation. The people didn't want him erased. They wanted him remembered, and they were going to carve his name into history with fire, because justice wasn't coming in the form of a trial. It was already waiting on the scaffold. There was no court, no jury, just a platform soaked in old blood and a crowd that had waited years to taste revenge. They read his crimes aloud, not for justice, but for theater. Each accusation thundered like a curse. Extortion, false imprisonment, the rape of noblewomen, the starvation of cities, the corruption of a king. But the charges weren't what shocked the crowd. It was how many. The list stretched on for hours. By the time the last line was spoken, even the executioners looked exhausted. Hugh stood bound, trembling, not from guilt, but from disbelief. Somewhere in that warped mind, he had truly believed England would never dare to touch him. He looked for Edward, he looked for mercy, he found neither. There was no defense, because there was no need. The people weren't there to hear explanations, they were there to watch, and soon they would get more than they ever imagined. They didn't just kill him, they unraveled him. Stripped naked before a sea of screaming mouths, Hugh Despenser was tied to a wooden frame, arms out, legs splayed, flesh exposed to the cold November wind. No priest, no prayers. Only nails, hooks, and fire. He was hanged first, but not to die. The rope choked him half-conscious, then he was cut down gasping, eyes rolling, throat collapsed. The crowd cheered. They hadn't come to see a death. They came to see a soul broken open. Next came the knife. Castration, performed slowly, deliberately, held aloft for all to see. Some say they shoved his severed genitals into his mouth. Others say they burned them before his eyes. Either way, Hugh screamed, not like a man, not like a king's favorite, but like an animal being skinned alive. Then, as he writhed in agony, they opened him from navel to sternum. Guts spilled like snakes onto the platform, glistening with blood and steam. They pulled out his entrails by the foot, feeding them into a fire as he watched himself disappear. He was still breathing, still blinking, still there. Until finally they severed his head. But by then there was nothing left to kill, just the memory of power, now a corpse roasted in public flame. The crowd roared, not in joy, but in release. As if years of silence, shame, and fear had finally found a voice in the burning flesh of one man. His remains were scattered, his name cursed, his bones denied burial, but even ash leaves a shadow. And the shadow of Hugh Despenser would cling to the throne long after the screams had faded. You can burn a man's body, but you can't burn what he's done. Hugh Despenser died screaming, but the silence that followed was worse. The crowd dispersed, the ashes cooled, and the new regime rose, Isabella and Mortimer holding the boy king Edward III like a puppet crowned too early. They swore it would be different, cleaner, just, but rot doesn't vanish with one fire. The nobles who once praised Isabella began to fear her. Mortimer, too, grew drunk on control. Trials turned to purges. Gold vanished. Promises withered. Because Hugh's death hadn't healed England, it had infected it. Even Edward II, the man he once wrapped around his finger, was quietly murdered in captivity. His death cloaked in shadows, rumors, and screams behind stone walls. Some say it was revenge, others say mercy. But either way, no king walked away from Hugh Despenser untouched. He left no legacy, no bloodline, no heir, just scars, scars on the land, on the court, on the soul of a nation that learned, too late, that monsters don't need crowns, they only need permission. And in the end, Hugh had been given everything, even hell felt earned. And if you thought Despenser's fall was brutal, you've only seen the surface. The rot inside this kingdom ran deeper, through king, through queen, through every throne that dared to love too blindly or rule too long. Their stories, Edward, Isabella, are already whispered through stone and steel, and they're waiting for you. If you're still breathing after this, then follow the trail. There are darker fires yet to come. Some don't just burn men, they burn faith itself. And those flames are already rising.